Hello, and a very warm welcome to Sleep Tales. I am so happy you are here to relax with me tonight. Our story is about a young woman named Brynn and her journey of growth, loss, and finding a new home in a very unexpected place. Before we begin, please feel comfortable. Take a moment to settle in. If you enjoy our time together, I would be so grateful if you would subscribe to the channel, leave a like on this story, and perhaps write a comment to let me know where in the world you are listening from. It is always a joy to know where our stories are traveling. Now, let us begin. The farm was a small world of its own. It was a quiet place, a gentle place, tucked between a low green hill and a slow-moving creek. A single dirt lane connected it to the main road, but few cars ever came down that lane. The world of the farm was made of a small wooden house, a sturdy red barn, and fields that changed color with the seasons. In the spring, the fields were a deep, dark brown, freshly turned and ready for seeds. In the summer, they were a vibrant green, full of life and the promise of food. In the autumn, they turned to gold and yellow, ready for the harvest. And in the winter, they rested under a soft white blanket of snow. This was the world Brynn knew. It was the only world she had ever known. She lived in the small wooden house with her mother, Ilara. Brynn's father had passed away a very long time ago, when Brynn was too young to form a lasting memory of his face. She had only a single faded photograph of a kind man with smiling eyes who stood beside a younger Ilara. So for as long as Brynn could remember, it had always been just the two of them, mother and daughter. Their life was simple. It was a life of work, but it was a good life. They woke with the sun and slept soon after the moon rose. Their days were measured not by the hands of a clock, but by the tasks that needed to be done. There was planting in the spring, weeding in the summer, harvesting in the fall, and mending in the winter. They worked together, side by side. Often they worked in a comfortable silence. They did not need many words to understand each other. A look, a nod, a small gesture was enough. They knew the rhythm of the work, and they knew the rhythm of each other. Ilara had taught Brynn everything. She had taught her how to read the clouds in the sky to know if rain was coming. She had taught her how to feel the soil to know if it was ready for planting. She had taught her the names of every plant in their garden and every bird in the trees. Most of all, she had taught Brynn how to be patient, how to watch things grow, and how to find peace in the quiet work of their days. Their bond was as deep and as strong as the roots of the old oak tree that stood on the hill. It was a quiet love, a steady love, built on shared sunrises and a life of simple, honest work. Chapter 1. The Last Harvest. The sun came first to the window of Brynn's small room. It was a gentle light, soft and pale orange, that touched the old wooden floorboards and slowly climbed the wall. Brynn did not need an alarm clock. The sun and the birds were her clock. She opened her eyes and lay still for a moment, listening. She heard the first few chirps of the robins in the oak tree outside. She heard the gentle rustle of leaves in the early morning breeze. The air that came through her open window was cool and smelled of damp earth and sweet grass. It was the smell of late summer, a time of fullness and bounty on the farm. She swung her legs out of the simple bed and stood up. The wooden floor was cool beneath her feet. She dressed quickly in the clothes she had laid out the night before. Simple, practical clothes for a day of work in the fields. A soft cotton shirt and sturdy trousers. She ran a brush through her long brown hair and tied it back, keeping it out of her face. She walked out of her room and into the main room of the small house. It was a kitchen, a dining room, and a living room all in one. A large wooden table stood in the center. A simple stove stood against one wall, and a comfortable old armchair sat by the window. Her mother, Alara, was already awake. She was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal. Alara moved with a quiet grace, her motions familiar and practiced. She looked up as Brynn entered and gave her a small, warm smile. "Good morning," was all she said, her voice soft in the quiet house. Brynn smiled back and went to the sink to wash her face. The water from the pump was cold and refreshing. It woke her up completely. They ate their breakfast together at the big wooden table. They did not talk much. They did not need to. They ate their warm oatmeal with a splash of milk and a spoonful of honey from their own bees. The only sounds were the soft clinking of their spoons against the bowls and the chirping of the birds outside. Brynn watched her mother as they ate. Alara's hair was more gray than brown now, and there were fine lines around her eyes from years of smiling and squinting in the sun. But her eyes were still bright and clear. Her hands, though rough from years of farm work, were still steady. They finished their breakfast, and Brynn washed the bowls in the sink, while Alara packed a small lunch for them to take to the fields. A loaf of bread she had baked yesterday, a wedge of cheese, and 2 red apples. She would bring the small tray to the bedside, her heart filled with a hopeful prayer. Please let her eat today. Sometimes Alara would manage a few spoonfuls. Sometimes she would just shake her head, her eyes full of apology. On those days, Brynn would eat her own meal alone at the big table, the silence of the house pressing in on her. The world outside the house began to disappear. Brynn only went out to do the essential chores. Feed the animals, fetch water from the pump, bring in more wood for the fire. The rest of the time, she was inside. The house became her entire world. The fields, the barn, the creek, they all seemed very far away. She and her mother spent long hours together in the little bedroom. Sometimes they would just sit in silence, Brynn in a chair by the bed, her mother resting against the pillows. Brynn would mend clothes or read a book, the quiet whisper of the turning pages, a soft sound in the room. But often, they would talk. With her body growing weaker, Alara's mind seemed to travel back in time. She told Brynn stories Brynn had never heard before. She spoke of her own childhood in a small town, of playing with her brothers and sisters. She talked about meeting Brynn's father at a town dance. She described the way he smiled and the way he made her laugh. She told Brynn about their early years of marriage, their dream of buying this small piece of land and building a life together. Her voice would be soft, but her eyes would be bright with the memories. Brynn listened to every word. She felt like she was finally meeting the young woman her mother had been. She was learning about a life that existed long before Brynn's own. During one of these long afternoons, Alara looked at Brynn with a serious expression. "Brynn," she said, her voice a little stronger than usual. "This farm, It was my dream. It was your father's dream. But it does not have to be your dream." Brynn looked at her confused. This farm was her whole life. She could not imagine any other dream. Ilara seemed to understand her confusion. "You have a good heart," she continued, "and you have strong hands. You can do anything you want to do. You can go anywhere you want to go. You remember my story about the ocean? The world is full of places like that, full of wonders. I want you to see them. I do not want you to feel trapped here by my memory. This land should be a root, not an anchor. It should give you strength to grow, not hold you in one place forever. Promise me you will think about that. Promise me you will choose your own life." Brynn did not know what to say. She just nodded, a lump forming in her throat. The idea of a life away from the farm was terrifying, but the thought of disappointing her mother was even worse. As autumn bled into winter, the days grew colder and darker. The first snow came. It started as a few lazy flakes drifting down from a gray sky. But soon it was a thick, silent snowfall that covered the entire world in a blanket of pure white. The farm became even quieter. The snow muffled all sound. It was beautiful, but it was also isolating. It felt like the rest of the world had vanished, and only their small house remained. With the deep cold came a worsening of Ilara's condition. The cough was deeper now, and it left her exhausted. She spent most of her days sleeping. Brynn knew she needed help. There was a doctor in the small town a few miles away. Dr. Miller. He was an old man with kind eyes who had been the town doctor for 50 years. He had delivered Brynn when she was born. Brynn had not seen him in years. The trip to town was difficult now. The dirt lane was covered in snow, but she knew she had to go. She asked her neighbors, the kind family who lived down the road, if they could check on her mother. Then she hitched their old horse to the small sleigh and made the slow journey to town. The town was quiet under the snow. Smoke rose from the chimneys of the small houses. Dr. Miller's office was in his home. He listened patiently as Brynn described her mother's illness. His face was calm, but his eyes were serious. He packed his black leather bag and came back to the farm with her. He sat by Ilara's bed for a long time. He listened to her chest with his cold stethoscope. He took her temperature. He asked her gentle questions. Ilara answered in a voice that was barely a whisper. After he was done, he and Brynn went to the main room to talk. He stood by the warmth of the fire. "There is an illness in her lungs," he said in his low, calm voice. "It is very advanced. I have seen it before in older folks, especially after a hard life of work." He gave Brynn some medicine, a dark liquid in a small bottle. He said it might help with the cough and make her more comfortable. But his eyes told Brynn what his words did not. There was no cure. There was nothing he could do to make her better. All he could offer was a little comfort. He told Brynn to keep her warm and to make sure she drank water. He said she was a good daughter. He left, and the house felt even quieter after he was gone. The medicine did seem to help a little. Ilara's cough was less severe, and she was able to rest more peacefully. The days passed in a slow, quiet procession. Brynn lost track of time. Was it Tuesday or Friday? Was it the first week of winter or the third? It did not matter. Her world was the four walls of the house, the rhythm of care, the rise and fall of her mother's breath. She read to her mother from old books of poetry and stories. Elara could not always stay awake, but Brynn read anyway, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet room. She hoped that her mother could hear the stories in her dreams. One afternoon, Elara was awake and seemed more alert than she had been in days. The sun was shining brightly, reflecting off the snow outside and filling the little room with a clean, white light. She asked Brynn to help her sit up a little higher. She looked at Brynn, her eyes clear and focused. "My Brynn," she said, "you are so strong, stronger than you know." She reached out a thin hand and touched Brynn's cheek. Her hand was cool. "Do not be afraid of being alone," she whispered. "You will never be truly alone. Everything I have taught you, everything we have shared, will stay with you. It is a part of you now, like the color of your eyes. When you feel lost, just be still. Listen to the world. It will speak to you, just as it has always spoken to me. It will tell you what to do next. And do not be sad for too long. A life is like a season. There is a time for planting, a time for growing, and a time for the final harvest. My season is coming to an end. It was a good season, a very good season. Because I had you." Tears streamed down Brynn's face. She could not speak. She just held her mother's hand, clinging to it. The doctor came one more time. He did not bring his bag into the house. He stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, snow melting on his shoulders. He looked at Brynn with deep sympathy in his kind eyes. "It will not be long now," he said softly. "Just keep her comfortable. That is the best thing you can do." The final days were a blur of hushed quiet. Elara slept most of the time. Her breathing was shallow. Brynn did not leave her side. She sat in the chair by the bed day and night. She dozed off for a few minutes at a time, but she never truly slept. She just watched and waited. She held her mother's hand. She talked to her in a soft voice, telling her about her day, about the snow, about the fat squirrel that came to the windowsill. She did not know if her mother could hear her, but she talked anyway. One morning, just before dawn, Brynn was woken by a change in the silence. It was a subtle shift, a deepening of the quiet. She looked at her mother. Elara's eyes were open. She was looking at the window, where the first pale gray light of a new day was beginning to show. A small, peaceful smile was on her lips. She turned her head slowly and looked at Brynn. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. But Brynn understood. It was a goodbye. Elara's eyes closed. She took one last, soft breath, and then she was still. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence so deep and so heavy that Brynn felt she could touch it. The sound of her own heartbeat was loud in her ears. She sat there, holding her mother's hand, which was already beginning to grow cool. She did not cry. She was beyond tears. She felt a strange emptiness, a hollow feeling in her chest. The fire in the stove had gone out. The house was cold. she looked out the window. The sun was rising, painting the snow-covered fields in shades of soft pink and gold. A new day was beginning, a beautiful, cold, and silent winter day. For the first time in her entire life, Brynn was completely and utterly alone. The world of the farm, the world she had shared with her mother, was gone forever. There was only the quiet house, the white snow, and the vast, empty silence. Chapter 3. The Weight of the Land. The house was a hollow thing. It was a shell. After her mother was gone, the life of the house went with her. Brynn sat in the chair by the bed for hours. The sun rose higher, casting a bright, cold light into the room, but Brynn did not move. She still held her mother's hand. It was cold now, as cold as the winter air outside. The reality of it was a wall she could not see and could not climb. Her mind was quiet. There were no thoughts, only a great white emptiness, like the snow-covered fields outside the window. The world had stopped. The sound of a knocking at the door was a shock. It was loud and intrusive in the deep silence. For a moment, Brynn did not understand what it was. Then it came again, a firm, repeated rap on the old wood. She let go of her mother's hand and stood up. Her legs felt stiff and unsteady, as if she had not used them in a very long time. She walked slowly out of the small bedroom and through the main room. The fire in the stove was a bed of gray ash. The air was cold enough to see her breath. She opened the door. It was Mr. Henderson, their closest neighbor. He was a kind man with a weathered face and worried eyes. He was holding a small loaf of freshly baked bread, wrapped in a cloth. His wife had sent it. He saw Brynn's face, and the worry in his eyes deepened. He did not need to ask. He knew. He was the one who helped her. He and his wife, Clara. They came into the house, and their presence filled some of the terrible emptiness. Clara was a warm, round woman who moved with a quiet efficiency. She gently led Brynn to a chair at the kitchen table and made her a cup of hot, sweet tea. She spoke in a low, soothing voice, not asking questions, just making small statements. "The tea is hot. It will warm you." Mr. Henderson went into the bedroom. When he came out, he closed the door softly behind him. He said he would go to town and speak to the minister. He would take care of everything. Brynn just sat and nodded. She could not find any words. The world was moving again, but she was not a part of it. She was a stone in the middle of a stream, and the water of life was flowing around her. The next few days were a blur. Neighbors came to the house. They brought food that Brynn did not eat. They spoke to her in hushed, sympathetic tones. They offered words of comfort that she could not hear. She knew they were being kind, but their kindness was a distant thing, something happening on the other side of a thick glass wall. They helped clean the house. They kept the fire going. They took care of the animals in the barn, their familiar sounds a strange intrusion into Brynn's silent world. There was a small service in the town church. The church was cold. Brynn sat on the hard wooden pew, staring at the simple wooden box at the front of the room. The minister spoke of seasons and of a peaceful rest. Brynn heard the words, but they had no meaning. She felt nothing. It was as if her heart had been frozen solid, a block of ice in her chest. After the service, people from the town came to her and hugged her. They said her mother was a good woman. They said Brynn was a good daughter. She nodded and said thank you, her own voice sounding strange and far away. They buried her mother in the small cemetery behind the church on a hill that overlooked the town. They lowered the box into the cold, dark earth. Mr. Henderson threw the first handful of dirt. The sound of it hitting the wood was the first thing that felt real. It was a hollow, final sound, the sound of an ending. After everyone was gone, Mr. and Mrs. Henderson brought her back to the farm. They made sure the fire was strong and there was food on the table. They told her to call them if she needed anything at all. Then they left, and the house was silent again. But this time, the silence was different. It was not the numb, empty silence of the first day. It was a heavy silence, a silence filled with absence. Her mother was not in the next room. She was not sleeping. She was in the cold ground on the hill. She was gone. And the finality of that knowledge broke something inside of Brynn. The ice in her chest cracked, and the grief came. It came in a great, heaving wave that knocked her to her knees on the cold wooden floor. It was a pain so deep and so vast that she did not think she could survive it. She wept until she had no tears left, until her body was empty and her throat was raw. She wept for her mother. She wept for the life they had shared. And she wept for herself, for the terrible, crushing weight of being alone. In the weeks that followed, grief was her only companion. It lived with her in the small house. It sat with her at the empty table. It lay with her in her cold bed at night. It was the first thing she felt when she woke in the morning, and the last thing she knew before she fell into a troubled sleep. The farm, which had been the source of all her comfort and all her joy, became a place of relentless pain. Every object, every sound, every smell was a memory, and every memory was a fresh wound. She would walk into the kitchen in the morning, and her eyes would automatically go to the stove, expecting to see her mother standing there. The empty space was like a physical blow. She would reach for a mug in the cupboard, and her fingers would brush against the one with the small chip on the rim, her mother's favorite. A wave of sadness so strong would wash over her that she would have to sit down, her head in her hands. She tried to cook, but the familiar recipes felt wrong. The food tasted of ash in her mouth. She ate only when the hunger became a gnawing pain in her stomach. She ate standing up quickly, as if she could outrun the memories that lived at the kitchen table. The barn was no better. She would go out to do the chores, to force herself into a routine. But the barn was a museum of her mother's life. She would pick up a shovel, and her hands would feel the smooth, worn place on the handle where her mother's hands had rested for so many years. She would see the neat coils of rope hanging on a peg, just the way her mother had taught her to coil them. She would smell the scent of hay and old wood, a scent that had always meant safety and peace, and it would now bring tears to her eyes. The work itself felt different. It was no longer a shared effort. It was a solitary burden. Milking the cow was a chore, not a quiet morning ritual. The cow's warm breath on her hands was no longer comforting. It was just a reminder that she was the only one there to feel it. The fields were the worst. She could not look out the window without seeing ghosts. She saw her mother walking down the rows of corn, her head protected from the sun by a wide-brimmed hat. She saw the two of them, a younger Brynn and her mother, sitting under the big oak tree, sharing a lunch on a hot summer day. She saw them working side by side, their movements in sync, a silent dance of shared purpose. The land was not just soil and plants anymore. It was a storybook of their life together, and every page was a reminder of what she had lost. The wind in the bare branches of the trees no longer sounded like a whisper. It sounded like a sad, lonely sigh. She tried to keep the farm running. She told herself it was what her mother would have wanted. She told herself that the work would be good for her, that it would keep her mind from dwelling on her sorrow. So she forced herself out of bed each morning. She put on her work clothes and her heavy boots. She went through the motions of the day. She fed the chickens and collected the few eggs they laid in the winter. She milked the cow and churned the cream into butter. She brought in wood for the fire. She mended a broken fence post. She did all the things that needed to be done, but there was no life in her actions. She was a machine made of flesh and bone, performing tasks without thought or feeling. The work was impossibly heavy. Every bucket of water felt twice as heavy as before. Every load of wood seemed to require more strength than she had. The farm was a living thing, and it needed a constant supply of energy and care. Brynn felt like she had nothing left to give. Her own energy, her own will to live, was draining away day by day. The loneliness was a physical presence. It was a cold weight that sat on her chest, making it hard to breathe. The house was too big for one person. The silence was too loud. At night, she would lie in her bed and listen to the sounds of the old house, the creak of the floorboards, the rattle of the window frame in the wind. These were sounds she had heard her entire life. But now they were different. Before, they were the familiar sounds of home. Now, they were the sounds of emptiness. They were the sounds of a house that was missing its heart. Sometimes she would wake up in the dark, thinking she heard her mother cough in the next room. She would sit up, her heart pounding, a moment of hopeful confusion. And then the reality would rush back in, and the grief would be as raw and as sharp as it was on the first day. Her sleep was filled with dreams of her mother. In the dreams, Ilara was healthy and strong again. They were working together in the garden under a warm sun. They were laughing. The dreams were so real, so vivid, that waking up was a cruel punishment. She would open her eyes to the cold gray light of her room and the crushing weight of her real life. Some mornings, she did not want to wake up. It was easier to stay in the world of dreams, the world where her mother was still alive. Weeks turned into a month, and then another. The deep snow of winter began to melt. Patches of brown earth appeared in the fields. The creek began to flow faster, its water no longer trapped under ice. The world was slowly, reluctantly, waking up for spring. For Brynn, this was not a sign of hope. It was a sign of dread. Spring meant planting. It meant a whole new season of hard work. Work she did not have the strength or the will to do. How could she possibly plow the fields by herself? How could she plant all those seeds alone? The thought of it was exhausting, a mountain of effort she could not imagine climbing. The turning point came on a cold, rainy day in early spring. Brynn had woken up with a deep feeling of despair. She forced herself to go to the barn to milk the cow. When she was done, she was walking back to the house, carrying the heavy pail of milk. Her boots slipped on a patch of wet mud. She fell hard. The pail flew from her hand, and the warm, white milk spilled all over the dark, muddy ground. She sat there in the mud, soaked and cold, and stared at the white puddle. All that work, all that effort, wasted. It was such a small thing, a simple accident. But in that moment, it felt like the end of the world. It was a symbol of all her struggles, all her failures. She could not even carry a bucket of milk without falling. How could she run a whole farm? She did not get up. She just sat in the mud and the rain and cried. But these were not the hot, painful tears of early grief. They were cold, empty tears of defeat. She was tired. She was so deeply tired. Tired of being sad. Tired of being lonely. Tired of the memories. Tired of the work. Tired of the silence. She could not do it anymore. She could not live this life. As she sat there, her mother's words came back to her. The words she had spoken on that clear, cold afternoon in her bed. This land should be a root, not an anchor. It should give you strength to grow, not hold you in one place forever. Promise me you will choose your own life. Brynn had not understood them then, but she understood them now. Staying on the farm was not honoring her mother. It was chaining herself to a memory. It was trying to live a life that was no longer hers. Her mother would not have wanted this for her. She would not have wanted her to be so sad, so alone, so defeated. She would have wanted her to find a new life, a life of her own. A strange sense of calm washed over her. The decision, once made, felt right. It was a painful decision, a heartbreaking decision, but it was the right one. She could not stay. She had to leave. She did not know where she would go. She did not know what she would do, but she knew she had to leave this place of ghosts. She finally stood up, covered in mud and soaked with rain. She went back into the house. She took off her wet clothes and washed her face. She looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror by the sink. Her face was thin and pale. Her eyes were dull and empty. She had become a ghost herself, haunting the rooms of her own life. She had to leave to become a real person again. The next day, she walked to the Hendersons' farm. She told them her decision. They listened without interruption, their faces full of sympathy. They were not surprised. They had seen her struggle. When she asked if they would be willing to care for the land, to lease it from her, Mr. Henderson agreed immediately. He said it would be an honor to look after Alara's farm. They would keep it safe for her. They would care for her cow and her chickens. It would be here for her if she ever wanted to come back. Their kindness made her want to cry again, but she held the tears back. She had to be strong now. She spent the next few days preparing to leave. The task was simple because she was taking almost nothing with her. She packed a single small bag, a few changes of clothes, a small amount of money she had saved, the faded photograph of her parents. She walked through the house, deciding what to do with everything else. The furniture, the dishes, the tools. They were all part of a life that she was leaving behind. She decided to leave them. They belonged to the house. The hardest part was her mother's room. She had not gone in there since the day of the funeral. She took a deep breath and opened the door. The room was cold and still. A thin layer of dust covered everything. She opened the small wooden wardrobe. Her mother's clothes were still hanging there. They still held the faint, familiar scent of her mother, a scent of lavender and clean earth. Brynn touched the soft fabric of a worn cotton dress. For a moment, she was tempted to take it with her, but she knew she could not. It was a piece of the past, and she had to move forward. She closed the wardrobe door. Then she saw it. On the small bedside table, there was a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was the box where her mother kept her most precious things. Brynn had not seen her open it in years. She sat on the edge of the bed and lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a piece of faded velvet, were several small, carefully labeled paper packets. They were seeds. Brynn picked one up. The label, in her mother's neat handwriting, said Brandywine tomato. Another said lemon basil. Another moonflower. These were her mother's heirloom seeds, the seeds from the best and strongest plants, saved year after year. They were the heart of the farm. They were the promise of future life. This was what she would take. This was the part of her mother, the part of the farm, that she could carry with her. It was not a sad memory. It was a living legacy. It was a root she could plant in a new place. She carefully placed the wooden box in her bag. It felt right. It felt like she was not abandoning her past, but carrying the best of it with her. On the morning she was to leave, she woke before the sun. She did her chores one last time. She said goodbye to the animals. She stood in the barn and breathed in the familiar smells. She walked through the empty house, her footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. She touched the back of her mother's rocking chair. She looked out the kitchen window at the fields. She said a silent goodbye to the house, to the land, to the life that had made her. She left the key on the kitchen table. She picked up her small bag. She closed the door behind her and did not look back. She walked down the long dirt lane, the small wooden box of seeds safe in her bag. The sun was just beginning to rise, sending pale streaks of pink and orange across the eastern sky. A new day was beginning. She did not know where she was going. She was walking towards the main road, towards a bus that would take her away from the only home she had ever known. She was walking towards the unknown. She was scared. But for the first time in a very long time, she was not looking back. She was walking forward. Chapter 4: The City of Noise. The bus was old and smelled of diesel fuel and stale coffee. Brynn sat by the window, her small bag on her lap. The wooden box of seeds was tucked deep inside. She watched the farm disappear behind her, growing smaller and smaller in the distance. The fields, the barn, the house. They shrank until they were just a speck against the vast green landscape. Then they were gone. Her throat felt tight. Her eyes burned, but no tears came. She had cried all her tears. Now there was only a vast emptiness inside her, a hollow echo of what had been. The landscape outside the window changed slowly. The dirt roads turned into paved roads. The open fields gave way to scattered houses, then more houses, packed closer and closer together. Small towns appeared, with gas stations and small shops. The trees became fewer, replaced by telephone poles and power lines. The bus was filled with people she did not know. They talked loudly on small devices, or they stared out the window with blank faces. They were all going somewhere, living lives she could not imagine. Brynn felt invisible, a stranger in a world that was suddenly too big and too fast. After hours on the bus, the world outside the window changed again. It became a blur of steel and glass. Tall buildings rose up into the sky, touching the clouds. There were so many of them, stacked so close together that they seemed to block out the sun. The noise was overwhelming. It was a constant roar of traffic, the blare of car horns, the shouts of people, the distant wail of sirens. It was a chaotic symphony of human activity, a complete opposite to the quiet sounds of the farm. Brynn pressed herself against the window, her mind trying to make sense of it all. It was too much sight, too much sound, too much movement. The bus stopped in a large, busy station. People pushed past her, rushing to get off, to meet someone, to go somewhere important. Brynn stood for a moment, clutching her bag, feeling lost in the swirling crowd. She felt small and insignificant, a single leaf blown by a mighty wind. She found her way out of the station, following the stream of people. The city streets were a maze of concrete. Buildings stretched up endlessly. The sky was just a narrow strip of gray between the tall structures. The air smelled of exhaust fumes and hot pavement, a sharp metallic smell so different from the clean, earthy air of the farm. She had an address written on a piece of paper. It was for a cheap room she had found in the newspaper before she left. She walked, following the directions on the paper, her eyes wide, trying to take everything in. But there was too much. Too many faces, too many signs, too many lights. Her head began to ache. Her feet, used to soft earth, ached on the hard pavement. She felt a growing sense of panic. This place was not for her. She did not belong here. This was a place for fast, loud people. She was a slow, quiet person. Finally, after what felt like hours, she found the building. It was tall and old, its brick walls stained with years of city grime. The windows were small and square, many of them dark. A heavy metal door led into a dim hallway. The smell inside was different from the outside. It was a smell of old dust, stale cooking, and something else she could not name. It was not a comforting smell. She climbed 3 flights of stairs, her bag feeling heavier with each step. She found the door to her room. It was small, no bigger than her mother's bedroom on the farm. A narrow bed, a small table, a single chair. A tiny window looked out onto a wall of another building. There was no view of trees, no view of fields, only brick. It was the loneliest place she had ever seen. There was a shared bathroom down the hall and a small communal kitchen on the floor below. She put her bag on the bed and sat on the edge, the mattress creaking softly. The silence in the room was a small comfort, a quiet island in the roaring sea of the city. But it was not the peaceful silence of the farm. It was an empty silence, a lonely silence. The first few days in the city were a struggle. Brynn felt utterly lost. She did not know how to find food she liked. The small grocery stores were full of strange packages and processed foods she did not recognize. She missed her mother's cooking. She missed fresh vegetables from their garden. She missed the taste of clean, sweet milk. She felt a constant ache of hunger, not just for food, but for something familiar, something real. Her practical skills, the skills she had learned her whole life, were useless here. She knew how to plant seeds, how to milk a cow, how to mend a fence. None of these things were needed in the city. She did not know how to use the complicated machines, or how to navigate the busy streets, or how to talk to the rushing people. She felt like a child, bewildered and afraid. She walked the streets, looking for work. She saw signs for help wanted, but they were for jobs she did not understand. She went into a few shops, but when she tried to explain her experience, her voice was quiet and she stumbled over her words. People looked at her strangely. They seemed impatient. After many failed attempts, she finally found a job. It was at a large grocery store, stocking shelves late at night. The work was mind-numbing. She stood for hours, lifting boxes, arranging cans and packages. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, giving her a constant headache. The air conditioning was always too cold. She felt like a robot, her body moving without her mind. She finished her shifts exhausted, her feet throbbing, and would go back to her tiny room to fall into an uneasy sleep. The money she earned was barely enough to pay for her room and a few simple groceries. She had to be very careful with every penny. She rarely bought anything for herself, saving every extra coin. She felt a constant tension in her shoulders, a constant worry about money. On the farm, they had always had enough food, enough wood, enough to get by. Here, everything felt precarious. One wrong step, one missed day of work, and she could lose everything. She tried another job, washing dishes in a cramped restaurant kitchen. The heat and steam were unbearable. The noise of clattering plates and shouting cooks was constant. Her hands were always raw from the hot water and harsh soap. She felt invisible, just another pair of hands in a busy, frantic place. Her co-workers were mostly young men who spoke quickly in a language she barely understood. She ate her meals alone in a corner, watching them laugh and talk, feeling more isolated than ever. The longing for the farm was a dull ache that never left her. She missed the quiet. She missed the smells of the earth and the trees. She missed the feeling of the sun on her face in an open field. Most of all, she missed the feeling of belonging. Here, she belonged to no one and to nothing. She was just another face in a sea of faces. Her only comfort, her only true connection to her past, was the small wooden box of seeds. She had kept it carefully hidden, a secret treasure. One day, after a particularly hard shift at the grocery store, she could not bear the emptiness anymore. She went to a small hardware shop and bought a simple clay pot and a bag of potting soil. She brought them back to her room, her heart feeling a little lighter. She sat on the floor by her tiny window. The window looked out onto a grim brick wall, but a thin strip of sunlight managed to fall onto her windowsill for a few hours in the afternoon. She carefully opened the wooden box. The small paper packets were still there, just as her mother had packed them. She picked up the packet labeled lemon basil. She gently unfolded the paper and tipped a few tiny dark seeds into her palm. They were so small, so fragile, and yet each one held the promise of life. With trembling fingers, she pushed a single seed into the soft, dark soil in the clay pot. She covered it gently, just as her mother had taught her. She poured a few drops of water onto the soil. It was such a small thing, such a simple act. But as she sat there, watching the water soak into the earth, she felt a profound sense of peace. It was the first time she had felt peace since her mother had died. It was the first time she felt truly connected to something. Every day, she would check on her small pot. She would make sure the soil was damp. She would watch for the first sign of green. The window was not a window to the world anymore. It was a window to a tiny patch of hope. After a week, a small pale green shoot pushed its way up through the soil. Brynn gasped. It was so tiny, so delicate, but it was alive. She carefully nurtured it, talking to it in soft whispers, just as she used to talk to her plants in the garden on the farm. She moved the pot to catch every ray of sunlight that managed to pierce through the city's concrete canyons. The basil plant grew slowly. Its leaves were a vibrant green, their edges slightly crinkled. When Brynn gently brushed her fingers over them, they released a sweet lemon scent. It was the smell of home. It was the smell of her mother's garden. It was a tiny piece of the farm, growing on her windowsill, high above the roaring streets of the city. Tending to this one small plant became her most important task. It was her refuge. It was the only time she felt like herself. The city's noise would fade away, and she would be back in her mother's garden, her hands in the soil, her heart filled with a quiet contentment. She would spend hours just watching it grow. She learned the new rhythm of the city's light, how the sun moved across the sky, finding its way into her window at a certain time each day. She learned to protect the plant from the dry, dusty air that sometimes blew in through the window. She learned to give it just the right amount of water. It was a small, silent battle against the harshness of the city, and her little basil plant was winning. It was thriving. The sight of that one small plant, so full of life and green beauty, in the midst of all the gray concrete, began to change something within Brynn. It reminded her of the strength of nature, the stubborn will of a seed to grow, no matter where it was planted. It reminded her of the lessons her mother had taught her: patience, observation, and the simple magic of nurturing life. She was not useless here. Her knowledge was still valuable. It was just in the wrong place. She began to wonder if there was a place for her skills in this vast, loud city. The idea was a tiny spark, no bigger than the basil seed itself, but it was there. It was growing. The despair that had clung to her like a wet blanket began to lift just a little. She was still lonely. She was still grieving. But she had a plant, and the plant was a small living connection to the woman she missed and the life she had lost. It was a silent promise of new beginnings. Chapter 5. a seed of an idea. The job washing dishes did not last. One evening, after a particularly long and busy shift, Brynn felt a sharp pain in her back. The constant standing and bending over the low sink had become too much. The next morning, she could barely get out of bed. She knew she could not go back. The thought of the hot steam and the endless piles of dirty plates filled her with a sense of dread. She had saved a little money, enough for a few weeks if she was very careful. She needed to find a different kind of work, something quieter, something that did not break her body. She started looking again. She walked different streets this time, avoiding the noisy restaurant districts. She looked for smaller shops, for offices, for places that seemed calm. After several days of searching, she saw a small handwritten sign in the window of a tall, elegant building. It said, "Cleaner wanted, night shift." The building was much nicer than any she had been in before. The door was made of heavy, dark wood with a polished brass handle. It did not look like a place that would hire someone like her, but she was desperate. She took a deep breath and opened the door. The inside was quiet and cool. The floor was made of polished marble that reflected the soft lights from the ceiling. A woman sat at a large desk. She was wearing a crisp, dark suit. She looked up at Brynn, her expression neutral. Brynn asked about the job. Her voice was a small, timid sound in the grand lobby. The woman looked her over, then gave her a form to fill out. The next evening, Brynn was told to come back for a trial shift. The job was in a restaurant, but not in the kitchen. It was a fancy restaurant that took up the top 2 floors of the building. The cleaning was done after the restaurant had closed for the night, when all the customers and most of the staff were gone. The restaurant was called Aria. When Brynn arrived for her first shift, the last of the wealthy customers were just leaving. They were dressed in beautiful clothes and spoke in low, confident voices. They smelled of expensive perfume. Brynn felt clumsy and out of place in her simple work clothes. She was met by the manager, a man named Mr. Davies. He was stern and did not smile. He showed her what needed to be done. The dining room was a large, beautiful space with huge windows that looked out over the city. At night, the city was a sea of twinkling lights, a beautiful sight that made Brynn feel a pang of wonder and loneliness. Her job was to clean this room, to polish the dark wood tables until they shone, to vacuum the thick, soft carpet, to wipe down every chair, to make sure every surface was perfect for the next day. The work was quiet. It was solitary. For hours, she was alone in the vast, beautiful dining room with only the hum of her vacuum cleaner for company. It was physically demanding, but it was a different kind of work from the dishwashing. It was methodical and calm. She could take her time and focus on the details. She found a strange satisfaction in making the room perfect again. She liked the order of it. After a week, Mr. Davies told her the job was hers. She worked 5 nights a week, from midnight until the early hours of the morning. Her life fell into a new, strange rhythm. She slept during the day when the city was at its loudest. The sounds of traffic and people were the background noise to her dreams. She would wake in the late afternoon as the sun was beginning to set. She would tend to her small basil plant on the windowsill. It was growing strong and healthy. its green leaves a vibrant patch of life in her gray room. She would eat her simple dinner, then walk through the darkening city to her job. The restaurant was a world of contrasts. The dining room where she worked was a place of calm elegance, but it was connected to the kitchen, and the kitchen was a place of controlled chaos. Even though she did not work in the kitchen, she had to pass through it to get to the supply closet. When she arrived for her shift, the kitchen was usually in the final stages of service. It was a whirlwind of activity. Flames leaped from pans. Chefs shouted orders. Waiters rushed in and out through the swinging doors. The air was thick with the smells of cooking food, 100 different aromas all mingling together. It was intense and a little frightening, but it was also fascinating. At the center of this storm was the head chef. His name was Julian Croft. Brynn learned his name from the other cleaners. He was not a tall man, but he had a powerful presence. He moved through the kitchen with a speed and a focus that was amazing to watch. He seemed to be everywhere at once, checking a sauce, plating a dish, giving a sharp command to a younger cook. His face was usually set in a serious, concentrated expression. His eyes were dark and intense. They missed nothing. He demanded perfection. If a dish was not exactly right, he would send it back without a second thought. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise of the kitchen. When he spoke, everyone listened. Brynn was invisible to him. She was just a part of the background, a shadow that moved through the kitchen on her way to the closet. She kept her head down and tried to stay out of the way. She was terrified of him, but she also felt a strange kind of respect for him. He was a master of his craft. The food he created was like art. She would sometimes see the finished plates waiting to be taken out to the dining room. They were beautiful compositions of color and texture. She could not even imagine what they tasted like. She saw his passion, his complete dedication to his work. In a way, it reminded her of her mother. Her mother had the same kind of dedication to the farm, the same focus, the same deep knowledge of her craft. As part of her duties, Brynn had to clean the kitchen after the chefs had left. It was a huge task. The stainless steel counters had to be scrubbed until they gleamed. The floors had to be mopped. The giant stoves had to be wiped down. It was hard, messy work, but it gave her a closer look at the chef's world. She saw the tools he used, the ingredients he worked with. One corner of the kitchen was dedicated to fresh produce. There were crates of beautiful vegetables and fruits delivered fresh every day. And there was a small refrigerated section just for fresh herbs. This was the part of the kitchen that interested Brynn the most. She would see bundles of parsley, rosemary, thyme, and mint. The smells reminded her so much of her mother's garden. She could recognize each herb by its scent alone. She knew these plants. She knew how they grew. She knew what they needed to be healthy and strong. She began to notice something. The herbs that were delivered to the restaurant were not always in the best condition. They often looked a little tired, a little wilted. She would see bunches of basil with bruised leaves or sprigs of mint that were starting to turn brown at the edges. She knew why. These plants were delicate. They had been picked a long time ago, packed in boxes and shipped from far away. They had lost their life force. She also started to notice Chef Julian's frustration. The quality of the ingredients was a constant source of stress for him. He would often complain to his sous chefs, his second in command. Brynn would hear his sharp, frustrated voice as she passed through the kitchen at the beginning of her shift. "This parsley is limp. This thyme has no aroma. How am I supposed to cook with this?" His suppliers would promise better quality, but the next day, it would be the same story. One night, the issue came to a head. It was a particularly busy night. A food critic from a major newspaper was in the dining room. The pressure in the kitchen was intense. Everyone was on edge. Chef Julian was preparing a special dessert, a delicate creation that required fresh, perfect mint leaves for garnish. The box of mint that had been delivered that morning was in a terrible state. The leaves were small, bruised, and turning a sad shade of yellow-green. Chef Julian held up a sprig of the mint. His face was a mask of controlled fury. He called over his sous chef. "Look at this," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "This is garbage. It smells like wet grass. It has no life. It is an insult." He threw the sprig onto the stainless steel counter. It landed with a small, pathetic thud. "Get me the mint from the other supplier," he commanded. The sous chef looked nervous. "Chef, that is all we have." The other delivery did not come. The chef closed his eyes for a moment, his jaw tight. He took a deep breath. His frustration filled the entire kitchen. No one moved, no one spoke. The usual clatter and noise of the kitchen died down to a low hum. Brynn was standing near the entrance, on her way to the supply closet. She saw the wilted mint on the counter, and without thinking, without considering the consequences, she heard her own voice. It was a small, quiet sound in the suddenly silent kitchen. "The roots are probably cramped," she said. The entire kitchen staff turned to look at her. It was as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken. Chef Julian's eyes snapped open. He turned his head slowly and stared at her. His dark eyes were piercing. Brynn's heart leaped into her throat. She felt a hot flush of embarrassment and fear. What had she done? She should have stayed quiet. She should have remained invisible. "What did you say?" the chef asked. His voice was flat, without emotion. Brynn looked down at the floor. She wanted to disappear. I'm sorry," she stammered. "I just meant the mint. It looks like it was grown in a pot that was too small. When the roots get cramped, the leaves get weak, and the soil is probably depleted. There are no nutrients. That is why there is no smell." The words came out in a rush, a quiet stream of knowledge she had carried with her whole life. This was the language she knew, the language of plants. There was a long silence. Brynn kept her eyes on the floor, waiting to be fired. She could feel the stares of all the cooks. She had crossed a line. A cleaner did not speak to the head chef. A cleaner did not offer an opinion. The chef walked slowly towards her. She could see his polished black shoes stop in front of her. She forced herself to look up. He was looking at her, really looking at her for the first time. His expression was no longer angry. It was one of intense curiosity. He tilted his head slightly. "How do you know that?" he asked. His voice was still quiet, but it was no longer threatening. It was a genuine question. I grew up on a farm," Brynn said, her voice barely a whisper. We grew herbs. He continued to study her face for a moment. Then he looked back at the pathetic sprig of mint on the counter. He picked it up and looked at it again, as if seeing it in a new way. He looked at the roots of the small plant. They were indeed a tangled, dense mat. He rubbed one of the leaves between his fingers. He sniffed it. There was almost no scent. Everything she had said was true. He looked back at her. A farm, he repeated softly. He seemed to be thinking. The tension in the kitchen slowly began to ease. The other cooks started to move again, pretending to be busy, but they were all listening. The moment of crisis had passed. The chef had found a new focus for his attention. He stood there for a long moment, just looking at her. Brynn did not know what to do. Should she leave? Should she apologize again? Finally, he spoke. His voice was a challenge. If you know so much, he said, then grow it better. Grow me some mint. Mint that actually tastes like mint. He turned away from her then, his attention already back on the dessert he had to fix. The incident was over. He had already forgotten her, but Brynn had not forgotten. She stood there for a moment, her heart still pounding. Then she turned and hurried to the supply closet, her face burning. She had been so stupid, so reckless, but she had not been fired. He had challenged her. Grow it better. The words echoed in her mind. She did her work that night in a daze. As she polished the tables in the empty dining room, she could not stop thinking about what had happened. The fear and embarrassment began to fade, and something else took their place. A small, flickering spark of an idea. Grow it better. Could she do that? Here, in this city of concrete and steel? She thought about her little basil plant on her windowsill. It was healthy, it was fragrant, it was alive. She had grown that. She had taken a tiny seed and nurtured it into a beautiful plant in a place where it was not supposed to grow. What if she could do more? What if she could grow mint and parsley and thyme? When her shift was over, she walked home through the quiet pre-dawn streets. The city was asleep. For the first time, she did not see the city as a harsh, ugly place. She looked up. She saw the tops of the buildings, dark shapes against the lightening sky. She saw the roofs. They were flat. They were empty. They were vast, unused spaces, sitting under the open sky, collecting sunlight all day long. Her mind started to race. A roof was like a field, a very high field. It got sun. It got rain. If she had containers, she could fill them with soil, good soil, soil with nutrients. She could plant seeds. The seeds from her mother's box. She could build a garden in the sky. The idea was so big, so audacious, that it made her feel a little dizzy. It was a crazy idea, but it was also a beautiful idea. It was a way to bring the farm to the city. It was a way to use her knowledge, her skills. It was a way to do something that mattered, something more than just stocking shelves or cleaning floors. It was a way to create life and beauty in this lonely, gray place. She reached her building and climbed the stairs to her room. She went to the window and looked at her basil plant. Its green leaves seemed to glow in the morning light. It was a small, silent confirmation, a promise. Grow it better. She could do that. She would do that. The spark of an idea, born from a moment of fear, and a wilted sprig of mint had caught fire. In her small, lonely room, surrounded by the noise of the waking city, Brynn felt a feeling she had not felt in a very long time. It was a feeling of hope. She had a purpose again. She was going to build a garden in the sky. Chapter 6. The Rooftop Garden. The idea, once it had taken root in her mind, would not let her go. It was a tiny, warm light in the cold emptiness of her life. A garden in the sky. It seemed impossible. It seemed crazy. But the more she thought about it, the more it felt right. It was the only thing that had felt right since she left the farm. For the first time in months, she had a purpose, a direction. She was not just surviving anymore. She was going to build something. The first step was the hardest. She had to get permission. The building was managed by a superintendent, a grumpy older man named Mr. Petrov. He lived in a small apartment in the basement of the building. Brynn had only seen him a few times. He was usually frowning and carrying a toolbox. He did not seem like a man who would appreciate a crazy idea about a garden on his roof. For 2 days, Brynn practiced what she would say. She wrote down the words on a piece of paper, then tore it up. The words sounded foolish and weak. In the end, she knew she just had to go and speak from her heart. She went to his door in the late afternoon. She knocked softly. The door opened a crack, and Mr. Petrov peered out. He was a large man with a thick gray mustache and small, suspicious eyes. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice a low grumble. Brynn's courage almost failed her. She clutched her hands together to stop them from shaking. I live in apartment 3B, she began, her voice small. "I have a question." He sighed, a long, tired sound, but he opened the door a little wider. She explained her idea. The words tumbled out, not as practiced as she had hoped, but they were honest. She talked about the empty roof, all that unused space. She talked about her experience growing things. She explained that she could build containers, bring her own soil, and that it would not cause any damage. She told him she wanted to grow some herbs, and maybe a few vegetables. Mr. Petrov listened, his expression unchanging. He looked at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. "A garden," he said when she was finished, his voice full of disbelief. "On the roof." "Young lady, this is a building, not a farm. The roof is for the water tower and the vents. It is not a park." He started to close the door. "Wait," Brynn said, a little louder this time. "Please, it would be very neat and quiet. It would not bother anyone." And she hesitated, then played her last card. "And I would be happy to share. Anything I grow, you can have some. Fresh tomatoes, fresh herbs for cooking." She remembered seeing a small, sad-looking parsley plant on his kitchen windowsill once when his door was open. Mr. Petrov stopped. He looked at her again, a flicker of something new in his small eyes. "Fresh tomatoes," he repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. He was quiet for a long time. Brynn held her breath. She could see him thinking, weighing the trouble against the promise of a fresh tomato. He had probably not had a real, garden-grown tomato in years. Finally, he gave another long, weary sigh. "One corner," he said, pointing a thick finger towards the ceiling. "The corner in the back, away from the equipment. You make one single mess, one drop of dirt in the hallway, and it is over. You understand?" Brynn's heart leaped. A wave of relief so strong washed over her that she felt lightheaded. "Yes," she said, nodding vigorously. "Yes, I understand. Thank you. Thank you so much." She almost wanted to hug him, but she knew that would be a terrible idea. He just grunted and closed the door. She stood in the dim hallway for a moment, a huge smile on her face. It was the first time she had truly smiled in a very long time. She had permission. The impossible had become possible. The next challenge was money. Her savings were small, a little cushion she had carefully built from her cleaning job. Buying supplies would use up almost all of it. It was a huge risk. If her garden failed, she would have nothing. She spent a whole evening at her small table, writing down a list of what she would need and calculating the cost. Soil, compost, a few simple tools. It was a lot of money. It was a terrifying amount of money. She thought about her mother's words. Choose your own life. This felt like the first real choice she had made. It was a choice to invest in herself, to invest in a dream. She took a deep breath and decided she would do it. The next day, she went to a large hardware store on the edge of the city. It was a place she had to take a bus to reach. The store was enormous, a warehouse filled with everything you could possibly need to build or fix anything. The smells of sawdust, metal, and fertilizer filled the air. She felt overwhelmed by the choices. There were dozens of different kinds of soil, hundreds of different tools. She remembered her mother's lessons. She looked for simple, strong things. She found a sturdy trowel and a small hand fork. She bought a large green watering can. The biggest expense was the soil. She knew she needed good soil. The life of her plants depended on it. She spent a long time reading the labels on the heavy plastic bags. She chose a dark, rich potting mix and several bags of compost to add nutrients. She also bought a few bags of small gravel for drainage, a trick her mother had always used to keep the plant roots from getting too wet. She paid for everything at the counter. The total made her stomach clench. It was almost all of her savings. The cashier helped her load the heavy bags onto a cart. She pushed the cart to the bus stop. Getting everything on the bus was difficult and awkward. The other passengers stared at her, this small woman with her mountain of gardening supplies. She ignored them, her mind focused on the goal. The journey back to her apartment was long and tiring, but the real work was about to begin. Her apartment was on the 3rd floor. The roof was 2 floors above that. There was no elevator in the old building. She had to carry everything up 5 flights of stairs. She stood at the bottom of the first flight, looking up. The task seemed monumental. She took the first bag of soil. It was incredibly heavy. She hoisted it onto her shoulder, staggering a little under the weight. She began to climb. The first flight was hard. Her muscles, not used to this kind of strain, protested. Her arms ached. Her legs felt weak. She reached the first landing, breathing heavily. She put the bag down and rested for a moment. Then she went back down for the next one. The bags of compost were just as heavy. Then the gravel. Trip after trip, she hauled her precious cargo up the stairs. One floor, then the next, then the next. Her body screamed in protest. Sweat poured down her face and stung her eyes. Her back ached with a deep, burning pain. But she did not stop. With each step, she felt a sense of determination growing stronger. This was not just dirt and gravel. This was the foundation of her new life. This hard work was the price she had to pay for her dream. She was building it with her own 2 hands, with the strength of her own body. It took her the entire afternoon. Finally, the last bag was on the 5th floor landing, just outside the heavy metal door that led to the roof. She was exhausted, her body trembling with fatigue, but a deep sense of accomplishment filled her. She had done it. She pushed open the heavy roof door and stepped out into the open air. The roof was a vast, empty space. The surface was covered in black tar paper. Vents and pipes stuck out in various places. A large wooden water tower stood on stilts in one corner. The air was different up here. It was windy. The sounds of the city below were a distant, muted roar. And there was so much sky. After being trapped between buildings for so long, the wide open expanse of the sky was a breathtaking sight. The sun was beginning to set, painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink. Brynn walked to the low brick wall at the edge of the roof. She looked out at the city, a sprawling landscape of buildings and lights. From up here, it was almost beautiful. This was her space now, her own little piece of the world, her farm in the sky. The next few days were filled with more hard work. She needed containers for her plants. She did not have the money to buy them, so she became a scavenger. In the early mornings, before the city was fully awake, she would walk the alleyways behind the shops and restaurants. She found discarded wooden pallets. She found old shipping crates. She found sturdy plastic buckets that had once held pickles or olives. She dragged them all back to her building and hauled them up to the roof. She was not a skilled carpenter, but she knew how to use a hammer and a saw. Mr. Petrov, seeing her struggling to break apart a thick pallet, came out of his basement with a crowbar and a better saw. He did not say anything. He just handed them to her and walked away. Brynn was grateful for the silent gesture of help. She spent hours building simple, sturdy planter boxes. They were not pretty. They were rough and uneven, but they were strong. She lined them with thick plastic she had found to protect the wood and keep the soil in. She drilled holes in the bottom for drainage and put a layer of the gravel she had carried up in each one. Then came the best part, the soil. She opened the bags and poured the rich, dark earth into her handmade boxes. The smell of the soil was the most wonderful smell in the world. It was the smell of life, of potential. It was the smell of home. She mixed in the compost, her hands sinking into the cool, crumbly mixture. She felt a connection to the earth that she had not felt in so long. Up here, on this city rooftop, surrounded by concrete, she was a farmer again. She arranged the boxes in the corner Mr. Petrov had assigned her. She placed them carefully, considering the path of the sun. She knew which plants needed full sun and which preferred a little shade. She was creating a landscape, a tiny, ordered world of her own design. When all the boxes were filled and ready, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The physical work was done. Now, the magic could begin. That evening, she brought her mother's wooden box up to the roof. The sun had set, and the city lights were beginning to twinkle on. She sat on the edge of one of her planter boxes and opened the lid. The small paper packets felt precious in her hands. She decided to start with the herbs for the chef. That was the promise she had to keep. She found a small packet with her mother's neat script, spearmint. She carefully opened it and shook a few tiny dust-like seeds into her palm. She went to one of the smaller boxes she had prepared. She made a shallow trench in the soil with her finger. She sprinkled the seeds gently, her heart beating a little faster. She covered them with a light dusting of soil, patting it down gently. Next, she planted the basil. Not just the lemon basil from her windowsill plant, which she would bring up later, but a deep purple variety and a classic sweet basil. Then thyme and rosemary and parsley. Each one planted with care, with a whispered word of hope. These were for her future. These were for her business, a word that felt strange and big in her mind. Then she opened the packets that were for her, the seeds that were a direct link to her mother, to the farm, the Brandywine tomatoes. Her mother had always said they were the most flavorful tomatoes in the world. The seeds were small and pale. She planted them in the largest box she had built, giving them plenty of room to grow. She planted cucumbers that would climb up a small trellis she would build. She planted small, sweet peppers, and in a special pot, she planted the moonflower seeds. Her mother had loved these flowers. They only opened at night, their large white blossoms releasing a sweet perfume into the dark. Her mother had said they were for the dreamers. When the last seed was planted, she took her new green watering can and filled it from a spigot she had found on the roof. She watered her new garden gently, the water making soft, whispering sounds as it soaked into the fresh soil. She felt like she was performing a sacred ritual. She was bringing life to this barren space. She was planting her roots in this new, strange place. The days that followed were a time of patient waiting. Every morning when she woke in the late afternoon, her first act was to go up to the roof. Every night when she came home from her cleaning job, her last act was to go up to the roof. It became her sanctuary. She would sit by her planter boxes, watching the soil, waiting for the first signs of life. The city could roar below her, but up on her roof there was a sense of peace. She felt closer to the sky, closer to the sun and the moon. She felt closer to her mother. She would talk to the seeds, to her mother, to the quiet sky. She told them about her days, about her hopes. After a week of anxious waiting, it happened. A tiny speck of green, then another, and another. The first seedlings were pushing their way through the soil. They were so small, so fragile, but they were a sign of victory. Life was taking hold. A wave of pure joy washed over Brynn. She had done it. She had created life where there was none before. The garden became her entire focus. Tending to it was not a chore. It was a joy. It was the reason she got out of bed. The grief for her mother was still there, a constant ache in her heart. But now, it was mixed with something else. It was mixed with purpose. When she was on the roof, her hands in the soil, the crushing loneliness would recede. She was not just a lonely girl in a big city anymore. She was a gardener. She was a caretaker. She was continuing her mother's work, but in her own way, in her own place. The plants grew quickly in the warm spring sun. The mint was the first to take off, sending out runners and filling its box with fragrant green leaves. The basil plants grew into lush, dense bushes. The tomato vines began to climb, their fuzzy leaves releasing a sharp, earthy scent when she touched them. She built small trellises for them from sticks she found. She weeded and watered and watched her plants grow stronger every day. Mr. Petrov would sometimes come up to the roof, pretending to inspect the water tower. He would stand at a distance, his hands on his hips, and look at her growing garden. He never said anything, but he did not look grumpy anymore. One day, he left an old, comfortable wooden chair near her garden. It was another silent gift. The time came for her first harvest. The mint was ready. The leaves were a deep, healthy green, and the scent was incredible. It was a sharp, clean, sweet smell that was a world away from the sad, wilted mint in the restaurant kitchen. She took a small pair of scissors and carefully snipped the best sprigs. She placed them gently in a small basket. She also cut some of the basil and the parsley. They were perfect. That night, she took the basket with her to work. She was more nervous than she had ever been in her life. This was the moment of truth. She walked into the kitchen. It was busy and chaotic as usual. Chef Julian was standing at the pass, inspecting plates. She waited for a moment when he was not shouting an order. She walked up to him, her heart pounding. "Chef," she said, her voice barely audible over the noise. He looked up, his expression annoyed. "What is it?" Then he saw the basket in her hands. He looked from her face to the basket and back again. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. I grew this," she said, holding out the basket. "The mint you asked for." He took the basket from her. He looked down at the herbs. He was silent. He picked up a sprig of the mint. He held it to his nose, his eyes closing for a moment as he inhaled the scent. He rubbed a leaf between his thumb and forefinger, releasing the oils. He then did the same with the basil. The entire time, his face was unreadable. Brynn stood there, twisting her hands together, expecting him to dismiss it, to say it was not good enough. Finally, he opened his eyes. He looked at her. "Where did you grow this?" he asked, his voice low and serious. "On my roof," she said. He stared at her for a long moment, a look of utter astonishment on his face. Then, for the first time since she had met him, a slow smile spread across his face. It transformed his entire expression. He looked down at the herbs again, shaking his head slightly in disbelief. "How much?" he asked. "How much for what?" she asked, confused. "For this," he said, holding up the basket. "All of it. How much do you want for it?" Brynn was stunned. She had not even thought about money. I do not know," she stammered. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of cash. He peeled off several bills and pressed them into her hand. It was more money than she made in 2 nights of cleaning. "Bring me this every day," he said, his voice firm. "Bring me everything you can grow. Basil, mint, parsley, thyme. Can you grow tomatoes?" "Yes," Brynn whispered, still staring at the money in her hand. "Good," he said. "Grow me tomatoes, and peppers, and anything else you have." He turned away then, his attention already back on a plate that needed to be perfect. "Bring me more tomorrow," he called over his shoulder. Brynn walked away from the kitchen in a dream. She went to the supply closet, but she just stood there for a long time, looking at the money in her hand. It was real. He had loved her herbs. He wanted more. Her crazy idea, her rooftop garden, was not just a hobby anymore. It was not just a sanctuary. It was a business, a real business. She had done it. She had planted a seed in the heart of the city, and it had begun to grow. Chapter 7. Growth and Storms. The money in her hand felt heavy and unreal. She kept it clenched in her fist for the rest of her shift, a secret warmth against her palm. As she cleaned the quiet dining room, her mind was not on her work. It was on the roof with her plants. A new energy surged through her, a powerful mix of excitement and fear. Chef Julian wanted more. He wanted everything she could grow. This was no longer just a small personal project. It was a promise she had to keep. The small seed of her idea was growing faster than she could have ever imagined, and she had to grow with it. The next day, she did not sleep. The sun was rising as she walked home from the restaurant, but she felt wide awake. She went straight up to the roof. The garden looked different in the morning light. It looked small. It was her whole world, but it was just one small corner of a very large roof. It was not enough. If she was going to supply a professional kitchen, she needed more space. She needed more plants. She needed to expand. Her first purchase with the new money was not for herself. It was for the garden. She went back to the hardware store, but this time she did not feel the same sense of fear. She felt a new confidence. She bought more bags of soil, more compost. She bought wood, this time new, clean planks, to build more planter boxes. She bought a stronger pair of scissors for harvesting and a reel of thick twine for making trellises. The work of carrying everything up the 5 flights of stairs was just as hard as it had been the first time, but her body felt stronger now. Her purpose was clearer. She spent the next few weeks in a frenzy of activity. Her life became a simple, repeating pattern of work. Clean the restaurant at night, tend to the garden during the day, sleep for a few hours in between. She built new planter boxes, bigger and sturdier than her first ones. She filled them with her precious soil. She planted more seeds from her mother's box, and she bought new ones from a small gardening shop she found. She planted different varieties of herbs: oregano, chives, cilantro, dill. She planted lettuces and spinach and small, spicy radishes. The back corner of the roof grew, transforming from a small patch of green into a sprawling, vibrant garden. Every night, she would harvest a basket of the freshest, most perfect herbs and bring them to Chef Julian. He was always waiting for them. He would inspect each leaf, each sprig, with the intense focus he gave to everything. He never said much, a nod of approval, a quiet good. but his eyes showed his satisfaction. And he always paid her in cash, generously. He started to rely on her. He would ask her for specific things. "Can you grow me some tarragon? I need tiny basil leaves for a garnish." She would listen carefully and do her best to grow exactly what he needed. Her relationship with the kitchen staff began to change. She was no longer just the invisible cleaner, she was the garden girl. The young cooks would look at her with a new respect. They were the ones who used her herbs, and they knew how much better they were than the ones that came in boxes from a truck. Sometimes they would ask her questions. "How do you get the mint so fragrant? What is the secret to your parsley?" She would answer them simply, sharing the knowledge her mother had given her. Chef Julian started to talk to her more. They were not long conversations, just small moments at the end of a busy service. He would ask about the garden. "How are the tomatoes doing? Are the peppers getting enough sun?" He seemed fascinated by her process. He was a man who controlled every aspect of his kitchen, every detail of his food. He understood the dedication it took to create something perfect. He saw that same dedication in her. A quiet, unspoken respect grew between them. He, the master of the kitchen. She, the master of the garden. Word of her herbs began to spread beyond the kitchen of Aria. One evening, a different chef was visiting Chef Julian. He was the head chef of another famous restaurant in the city. He tasted a dish that used Brynn's basil. He was amazed by the flavor. "Julian, where did you get this basil?" he asked. "My supplier gives me wet paper." Julian just smiled and pointed a thumb towards Brynn, who was quietly mopping the floor in a corner of the kitchen. The next day, the other chef found her. He offered to buy herbs from her as well. Brynn was shocked. 2 restaurants. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Could she produce enough? She looked at her expanding garden. She thought of the other empty rooftops she saw from her own. She said yes. This was the beginning of Sky Harvest. She did not have a name for it yet. It was just her garden, and her growing list of customers. She started a small notebook, keeping track of her orders and her earnings. The numbers were growing. She was making more money from her garden than she was from her cleaning job. She began to dream bigger. What if she could quit her cleaning job? What if the garden could be her only work? The thought was a wild, beautiful dream. With more customers came more challenges. She had to be organized. She had to plan her planting schedule carefully to ensure a steady supply. She had to learn about things she had never considered on the farm, things like invoices and delivery schedules. She had to learn about the business side of growing. She made mistakes. One week, she planted too much cilantro and not enough dill. Another week, a box of lettuce was eaten by aphids, a tiny insect she had never seen before. She had to learn about city pests, about how to deal with them without using the harsh chemicals her mother would never have used. She learned to make a simple spray from soap and water. She learned to encourage ladybugs, who ate the aphids. She was constantly learning, constantly adapting. She also had to learn about the city itself. To make her second delivery, she had to navigate the city's complicated subway system, carrying a precious, fragile cargo of fresh herbs. It was a stressful journey, trying to protect the delicate leaves from being crushed in the crowded cars. But when she delivered them, and saw the second chef's face light up with the same delight as Chef Julian's, she knew it was worth it. Her world, which had been so small and lonely, was beginning to expand. She started to feel like a part of the city, not just a lost soul within it. She had a place. She had a purpose. She was the rooftop gardener. One day, Mr. Petrov brought another person up to the roof. It was a young man who lived in the building on the 4th floor. His name was Leo. Brynn had seen him around. He was quiet, like her, and always seemed to be carrying a book. Mr. Petrov introduced them gruffly. "This is the girl with the garden," he said to Leo. "This is the boy who needs a job." He then turned and left them alone. Leo was thin, with kind eyes behind a pair of glasses. He explained that he was a student, and he was looking for part-time work. He said Mr. Petrov had told him about the garden, and he thought it was amazing. He asked if Brynn needed any help. Brynn looked at him. She had never thought about hiring anyone. Sky Harvest was just her. The idea of having someone else work in her sanctuary felt strange, but she was so tired. The long nights of cleaning and the long days in the garden were taking their toll. She was stretched thin. She looked at her ever-expanding garden. It was too much for one person. She needed help. She told him she could not pay very much. He said that was okay. He just wanted to do something real, something with his hands, after spending all day reading books. She agreed to give him a try. He became her first employee. Leo was a fast learner. He was not a farmer, but he was smart and he was a hard worker. Brynn taught him how to mix the soil, how to plant the seeds, how to water the plants gently. He was good at the heavy lifting, carrying the bags of soil and building the new planter boxes. He was quiet and respectful of her space. They would often work for hours in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the scrape of a trowel in the dirt and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Having him there eased her burden, and to her surprise, it eased some of her loneliness too. It was nice to have someone to share the quiet work with. With Leo's help, the garden grew even faster. They took over another corner of the roof. Brynn quit her cleaning job. It was a terrifying and exhilarating day. She went to Mr. Davies and told him she was leaving. He was surprised, but when she explained about her growing business, he wished her well. She walked out of the restaurant that night, not as a cleaner, but as a business owner. She was her own boss now. But with greater growth came greater risks. The one thing Brynn could not control was the weather. On the farm, she had understood the weather. She knew the signs of a coming storm. The way the air felt, the color of the clouds on the horizon, the behavior of the birds. Here in the city, the weather was different. It could change in an instant. The tall buildings created their own strange winds and weather patterns. One day in the middle of summer, the sky turned a strange, dark, greenish gray. The air became heavy and still. Brynn was on the roof with Leo, harvesting tomatoes. She looked at the sky, and a feeling of deep unease settled in her stomach. This looked like a bad storm, a really bad storm. The kind of storm that brought hail and high winds. On the farm, a storm like this could wipe out an entire crop in minutes. She looked at her beautiful, thriving garden. Her tomato vines were heavy with ripe, red fruit. Her delicate lettuce leaves were tender and green. They were all so exposed, so vulnerable, up here on the open roof. The city's emergency sirens began to wail, a low moaning sound that echoed between the buildings. A storm warning, severe thunderstorm, possible hail. Brynn's heart sank. Everything she had worked for, everything she had built, was in danger. "We have to protect the plants," she said to Leo, her voice urgent. He looked at the sky, his eyes wide with worry. "How?" he asked. She thought back to the farm. What would her mother do? When a hailstorm threatened, they would cover the most delicate plants with buckets, with tarps, with anything they could find. "We need to cover them," she said. A frantic race against time began. The wind began to pick up, whipping at their clothes and tearing at the leaves of the taller plants. The first fat drops of rain began to fall. Brynn and Leo rushed around the garden, trying to protect what they could. They found old sheets and blankets they had stored for covering plants against frost. They stretched them over the rows of lettuce and spinach, weighing them down with bricks and rocks. They took the smaller, more delicate herb pots and moved them to the shelter of the wall next to the roof door. The tomato vines were too big to cover. The beautiful, heavy fruit was completely exposed. The thought of them being smashed to pulp by hail was devastating. Brynn looked around desperately. She saw a pile of the wooden pallets she had collected for building more boxes. An idea sparked. She and Leo dragged the heavy pallets and leaned them against the tomato trellises, creating a makeshift roof, a crude but strong barrier against the coming storm. The storm hit with a sudden, violent fury. The sky opened up. Rain came down in solid, blinding sheets. The wind howled like a hungry animal. And then came the hail. It was not small. It was the size of marbles, then the size of acorns. It hammered down on the roof, the sound a deafening roar on the tar paper. Bride and Leo huddled in the small, protected space by the door, watching in horror as the storm unleashed its power on their garden. The hail bounced off their makeshift pallet roofs. It shredded the leaves of the taller, unprotected plants. It was a scene of chaos and destruction. The storm lasted for 20 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The rain softened to a drizzle. The wind died down. A strange, watery sunlight began to break through the dark clouds. Brynn and Leo slowly emerged from their shelter. They looked out at the garden. Brynn's heart was in her throat. She was afraid to look too closely. The garden was a mess. Leaves were torn and tattered. The soil in the boxes was pockmarked from the impact of the hailstones. Some of the smaller plants were flattened. But as they looked closer, they saw that most of the garden had survived. The sheets had protected the delicate greens. The herbs by the wall were safe. And when Brynn carefully lifted one of the heavy pallets, she saw that the tomato plants, though a little battered, were still standing. The precious fruit was mostly unharmed. A wave of immense relief washed over her. They had not lost everything. Their frantic efforts had saved the heart of the garden. It was damaged, but it was not destroyed. Leo let out a whoop of joy. Brynn just leaned against a planter box, her legs weak with relief. They had faced their first great challenge, their first storm, and they had weathered it. That night, she delivered a slightly smaller, slightly more battered basket of herbs to Chef Julian. She explained what had happened. He listened, his expression serious. He looked at the herbs. They were not perfect, but they were still fresh, still fragrant, still better than anything he could buy from a supplier. He took the basket. "Tough day," he said. It was the first time he had said something to her that was not about the plants. It was a small moment of human connection, of shared understanding of the struggles of a craft. "She is strong, your garden," he added, "like the gardener." Brynn walked home that night feeling a new kind of strength. The storm had been terrifying. It had threatened to destroy everything she had built, but it had not defeated her. She had used the knowledge her mother had given her, the lessons of the farm, and she had adapted them to this new, strange environment. She had protected her garden. She had protected her dream. She knew there would be other storms. There would be pests and droughts and 100 other challenges she could not yet imagine. But she also knew that she was strong enough to face them. She was a survivor. Just like the tough, resilient little plants on her rooftop, she had put down roots in this city, and she was not going to be easily broken. Chapter 8. A New Harvest. The weeks after the storm were a time of healing and rebuilding for the garden and for Brynn. She and Leo worked tirelessly to clean up the damage. They pruned the torn leaves, staked up the battered plants, and added fresh compost to the soil to give them new strength. The garden, battered but not broken, responded. New leaves grew, tender and green. The tomato vines, safe behind their pallet shields, continued to produce beautiful, heavy fruit. The resilience of the plants was a quiet inspiration. They, like Brynn, had faced a great challenge and had survived. The experience had made them stronger. Her business, Sky Harvest, continued to grow. The story of the rooftop garden that had survived the great hailstorm spread through the city's restaurant community. Chefs, who valued resilience and quality above all else, were impressed. More orders came in. Soon, Brynn was delivering to 5 different restaurants. Her daily routine was a busy, focused cycle of planting, tending, harvesting, and delivering. Leo became an indispensable part of the operation. He was no longer just a helper. He was her partner in the garden. He took over the deliveries, navigating the city's subways with a new confidence, leaving Brynn more time to focus on what she did best: growing. She expanded the garden again, this time with a clear plan. She and Leo built a small, simple greenhouse on one corner of the roof, a frame of wood covered in thick plastic sheeting. This would allow her to grow delicate herbs and greens, even when the weather turned cold. She was thinking ahead, planning for the seasons, just as she and her mother had always done on the farm. She was no longer just reacting to challenges, she was anticipating them. The success of the business brought changes to her life. The constant worry about money began to fade. The wad of cash she kept in a small box under her bed grew steadily. One day she walked into a bank and opened her first bank account. It was a simple act, but it felt like a huge step. She was no longer living day to day. She was building a future. She was able to move out of her tiny, grim apartment. She found a slightly larger, brighter room in a quieter building, one with a window that got the morning sun. She bought a new bed and a small, comfortable armchair. These small luxuries felt monumental, but the most important change was inside her. The deep, heavy grief for her mother had not disappeared. It was still a part of her, a quiet ache that she knew would always be there, but it no longer defined her. Her days were now filled with purpose, with the challenges and joys of her work. The crushing loneliness that had haunted her for so long had been replaced by a quiet contentment. She had found a community. She had Leo, her silent, steady partner in the garden. She had the chefs who respected her work. She had Mr. Petrov, who now greeted her with a nod and sometimes even a small smile, and who always accepted his weekly basket of fresh vegetables with a proud grumble. She was not alone anymore. Chef Julian remained her most important customer, and their relationship continued to grow. He would sometimes come up to the roof after the lunch service was over. He would walk through the garden, his white chef's coat a stark contrast to the green of the plants. He rarely spoke much. He would just look, touching a leaf, smelling an herb. Brynn understood. This was his way of connecting with the source of his ingredients. He was a man who believed that great food started with great respect for the earth. On her rooftop, he found a piece of that connection in the heart of the city. He saw in her the same deep respect for the land that he felt for his food. One warm evening in late summer, a year after she had first arrived in the city, Brynn was on the roof, tending to her moonflowers. The vines had grown thick and strong, and they were covered in long, elegant buds. As the sky darkened, the buds began to unfurl, opening into huge, luminous white blossoms. A sweet, intoxicating perfume filled the night air. Leo had gone home. The city below was a distant murmur. It was a moment of perfect peace. She thought about how much her life had changed. A year ago, she had been a lost, broken girl, overwhelmed by grief and fear. Now, she was a business owner. She was a creator. She had built this beautiful, thriving world from nothing but a box of seeds and a crazy idea. She had found her own way to honor her mother, not by staying in the past, but by planting her mother's legacy in a new and unexpected place. The time felt right. She had been putting it off, afraid of the emotions it would bring up, but now she felt ready. She decided to go back. She needed to see the farm. She took the bus the next morning. As the city receded and the landscape opened up into green fields and rolling hills, a sense of calm settled over her. This land was in her blood. It was a part of who she was. She was not afraid of it anymore. She got off the bus at the familiar crossroads and began the walk down the long dirt lane. The air was sweet and clean. It smelled of hay and wildflowers. The sound of the wind in the tall oak tree on the hill was like a welcoming whisper. The farm came into view. The house, the barn. They looked the same, but smaller than she remembered. Mr. Henderson saw her coming and walked out to meet her. He had a warm, kind smile on his weathered face. He told her they had been taking good care of the place. The fields were planted with corn, tall and green. The fences were mended. The house was clean. He handed her the key. "It is your home, Brynn," he said. "It will always be here for you." She walked into the house alone. It was clean and quiet. The furniture was still there, draped in white sheets. The air was still and smelled of old wood and dust. But it was not a sad smell. It was just the smell of a house that had been sleeping. She walked through the rooms. She touched the back of her mother's rocking chair. She looked out the kitchen window at the fields. She felt a pang of sadness, a memory of the life that had been. But the sharp, tearing pain of grief was gone. It had been replaced by a gentle, quiet love. She went upstairs to her mother's room. The small wooden box was gone from the bedside table. It was with her, in the city. She opened the wardrobe. Her mother's clothes were gone. Mrs. Henderson had packed them away for her. It was better this way. She did not stay long. An hour was enough. She had not come back to stay. She had come back to say a proper goodbye and a proper thank you. She locked the door and gave the key back to Mr. Henderson. She thanked him and Clara for everything. She promised to visit again. As she walked back down the dirt lane, she did not feel like she was leaving home. She felt like she was leaving a beautiful, cherished part of her past. Her home was somewhere else now. Her home was in the city, in a small, bright room with a sunny window. Her home was on a rooftop, surrounded by green and growing things. The final scene of the story takes place a week later. It is dawn. Brynn is on the roof of her building. The city is still sleeping below, a vast landscape of gray buildings under a soft pink and purple sky. The air is cool and still. She is not alone. Leo is there, quietly harvesting lettuces for the morning deliveries. The garden is thriving. It is a riot of green, dotted with the bright red of ripe tomatoes and the cheerful yellow of squash blossoms. It is a testament to a year of hard work, of tears and struggle, and of quiet, stubborn hope. Brynn is on her knees, her hands deep in the soil of a new planter box. The soil is dark and rich and cool. She crumbles it between her fingers, feeling its familiar, comforting texture. This is her earth. This is her land. She has created it herself. She takes a handful of tiny seeds from a small paper packet and sprinkles them into a shallow trench. She covers them gently, her movements practiced and sure. She is planting a new crop for the coming season. She is planting for the future. She looks up, out over the edge of the roof, at the sprawling city awakening below. The first rays of the sun catch the tops of the tallest buildings, turning them to gold. The distant roar of traffic is just beginning, a low hum that is no longer frightening, but simply the sound of the world waking up. She is a part of this world now. She has found her place in it. She has built a new life, a life that is uniquely her own, a life that honors the past but is not trapped by it. She has taken the lessons of the farm, the love of the earth that her mother gave her, and she has made them bloom in the most unlikely of places. She is Brynn, the rooftop gardener, and as the sun rises over the city, she smiles. She is home.